Sobat Iconic, selamat datang di Main Conference Iconic 2020. Sebelumnya, saya perkenalkan diri saya Francisca Renata yang akan menjadi MC Anda untuk hari ini. Thank you for your participation and you're about to enter Plenary Session 4 about arts and activism with our respectable speakers, Dr. Ari Yogaswara Adipura Wawijana, MA, dan Profesor Dr. Doreen Lee, and the discussion will be led by Mrs. Herlin Putri, MA. Untuk Mbak Herlin, selamat pagi. Apa kabar, Mbak?
Selamat pagi, kabar saya baik. Semoga Mbak juga baik.
Apa kabar? Semoga baik-baik aja ya, Mbak. Untuk itu, untuk memulai diskusi pagi hari ini, saya langsung persilahkan Mbak Herlin untuk memimpin diskusi pagi ini.
Terima kasih, Mbak Siska. I have been told by the committee to lead this discussion in English, so I will try to speak in English. So thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to chair our panel discussion this morning. Our respectable speakers will explore the powerful intersections of arts and social movement and how arts can promote creative expressions to bring unheard voices to life. So we have two video presentations from our distinguished speakers. The first one is from Professor Dr. Doreen Lee. Dr. Lee is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in Northeastern University, Boston. Her research projects focus on urban politics, Southeast Asia, and critical theory. Dr. Lee received her undergraduate degrees in archaeology from New York University and her PhD from Cornell University. Recently, she has been awarded the Harry G. Benda Book Prize by the Southeast Asia Council of the Association for Asian Studies in recognition of her book entitled Activist Archives, Youth Culture and the Political Past in Indonesia. In her video presentation, which we are going to watch, Dr. Lee will address how creative communities in Indonesia respond to the challenges posed by fragmented infrastructure, strained state-citizen relations, and top-down development projects that seem to threaten to completely destroy local residents. And our second distinguished speaker is Dr. Ari Jogaiswara. He teaches and carries out studies on English literature, theater and performance, and critical theory in Universitas Padjadjaran Bandung. He used to work as an adjunct lecturer in the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He earned his Master's of Arts in English Language and Literature from University of Kentucky, Lexington, and his doctoral degree from Universitas Padjadjaran. He's interested in contemporary texts and their distribution through the publishing industry in the post-colonial framework, looking at how text productions, technology, and global economy intersect. Such studies direct his attention to race, gender, and class bodies, which has led his interest in the idea of practices research in the context of theater and performance as alternative literacy and a means to incite social participation. So this morning, Dr. Jogaiswara, through his video presentation, will share about the potential of arts as interdisciplinary intervention and address a crucial questions of how artists, activists, and academics can collaborate for this vision. So before we watch the video, I would like to remind the participants that if you have questions or comments about our topic, you can type your questions in the chat room. And since Dr. Lee unfortunately cannot be with us today in our discussion, so if you have questions for her, please write your email address next to your questions so the committee can forward your questions to Dr. Lee later on. Right, so without further ado, I will let the committee to set up the video presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Professor Doreen Lee. I'm a professor of anthropology at Northeastern University in Boston. So I'm joining you from Boston, which is 12 hours behind. I will be speaking about art and activism in today's panel. And the title of my paper is The Infrastructure of a Small Place, Broadcast from a Globalized Art Village in Indonesia. I'm here to tell the story of a now very famous art collective called Jatiwangi Art Factory, and it's JAF for short. And I'm here to talk about three things. Scale, first of all. What does it mean to think about a small place as the site of activity, productivity, and even a politics of place? And here I'm focusing on the activities of JAF, which involve the village level, the sub-district level, and the regency level, and then beyond that, the international level. I'm also here to talk about art as activism, on different ways of engaging in locality with local citizens, with a high degree of engagement and participation. And so I think today's topic in my paper is a little bit different from the usual way that art is talked about in terms of activism. We see much more discussion of activist art as representation of certain issues, or art as critique, especially political critique, or art in the form of graffiti, for example, which is a very popular genre of activist art. But here I'm going to talk about something different. And the last thing I'll talk about is the question of infrastructure and connectivity in non-urban contexts, and how this impacts the kind of activism that artists are able to do in small places such as Jatiwangi in West Java. So the paper I'm about to give explores smallness as a quality of civic life and infrastructural capability in a non-urban context. I'm going to focus on the work of placemaking and identity making carried out by the artists and activists of Jatiwangi Art Factory, or JAF, a thriving multimedia and performance arts community based in Jatiwangi, a small sub-district in rural West Java. Jatiwangi is located approximately an hour and 20 minutes by car from the southern port city of Cirebon, about 3 hours from Bandung, the cultural urban center of West Java, and 3.5 hours by train from Indonesia's capital city, Jakarta. It is primarily rural, with most of the land use designated as farmland for rice cultivation, but also contains an important roof tile cottage industry that has lasted for over a century. Jatiwangi's size and location present important divergences from recent anthropological studies that measure citizenship through infrastructural connections and disconnections in large urban centers. The Right to the City literature, for example, underscores the significance of securing connections in these urban struggles. Yet the urban emphasis in such territorializing claims to citizenship do not capture the different dreams and aspirations for rural citizens, for whom the city does not beckon. That is to say, the city can be an unappealing place for non-urban citizens. In this paper, I pay attention to the way local actors from small places deploy different strategies to consolidate local heritage and identity, even as they negotiate with, rather than reject, large-scale private and state-led infrastructural interventions. It is hard not to view the story of a small place as an infrastructural story, whether that is because the anthropology of infrastructure is now so prolific that we are fully cognizant of the physical, systematic, and material networks that compose daily life, or whether it is because infrastructure as project has become the dominant national agenda of the current presidency, such that once out of the way places, or rather marginal locations like Jatiwangi, are becoming integrated into a national network of airports, roads, factories, and malls. Under President Joko Widodo, there has been a renewed commitment to a techno-political vision for Indonesian modernity, entailing close cooperation with Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean interests. Roads, railways, large-scale agribusiness, and real estate developments are complex projects that conjure a mix of public-private partnerships, municipal, national, and international finance, and a compressed and aspirational timeline to completion. The techno-political cast of infrastructure neutralizes much of the sting of displacement with the balm of progress. We can discern from celebratory media reports and local residents' own narratives about infrastructural change a kind of inevitability as Jatiwangi's landscape is nationalized, conjuring its new geolocation out of a matrix of toll roads, international airports, shopping squares, and export-oriented garment factories. Yet how much more connected and accessible is Jatiwangi as a result of these changes? What modes of intensification can we study to understand other ways of being embedded in local, national, and international landscapes? And next, I'm going to talk about local engagements of nationalized space. The new Cipali toll road connecting Cikopo and Palimanan in West Java cuts through the farmlands of Jatiwangi at around the 166-kilometer mark. Ambitious forecasts are projected upon this road, billed as the longest toll road in Indonesia. The president himself opened the road on June 13, 2015, in anticipation of easing that year's Idul Fitri traffic. It aimed to reduce traffic on the overburdened North Coast Highway by 40%. Yet as late as June 3, 2015, the Cirebon newspapers, as well as the Bandung-based Pikiran Rakyat, were still reporting protests by hundreds of villagers from 6 villages in Majalengka Regency, including residents of Jatiwangi, over unfair and delayed compensation. The protests had resulted in physical destruction to the unopened highway, and on June 29th, the protesters returned for an even bigger protest, blockading the road. A year later, the protest over uncompensated land had dissipated. In fact, Jeff Artist told me a different story about a major success in the struggle. While residents knew it was impossible to delay or defeat the massive infrastructure project, they had succeeded with Jeff's careful advocacy in pressuring urban planners to raise a section of the toll road and to build a new footpath and tunnel so that villagers can continue to access the fields on the other side of the 4-lane toll road. And indeed, when I visited in 2016, the activists took me through that little tunnel. So when I visited Jeff in August of 2016, one of the new hotspots I was told about was a recreation site that I thought was strangely named. Jeff Artist referred to it by an English name. They called it the rest area. So, for example, an artist said to me, "Let's go picnic in the rest area." My goal to see all that was new in Jatiwangi since my last visit almost 4 years ago resulted in a long itinerary. They decided that someone would take me to the roof tile museum that Jeff activists were constructing near the new Majalengka Water Park. Another activist would take me to see the generically named and foreign-sounding rest area. He drove me on his motorcycle through narrow roads that took us through pretty residential neighborhoods until all the buildings had receded from sight. Soon we reached the end of the rice fields, bound by low concrete walls above which loomed a new toll road. He parked at an opening in the concrete wall, which served as the workers' entrance to a field that served as a parking lot. The rest area turned out to be a large, unfinished rest stop on the side of the Cipali toll road, the last of 8 brand new rest areas on the Cipali highway map, which is the map you see right now. The rest area appeared international in that its architecture bore no distinguishing features at all. The sleek red Pertamina gas station, with its dozen filling stations, was clearly visible from the road. There was an open-air seating area, a sheltered food court, a mini-mart, a prayer room, and restrooms. It took less than 15 minutes to arrive by motorbike. yet the difference between the dense village landscape and the geometric lines of blinding white road were striking. All was clean and bright and straight, pulling Jatiwangi into an existing system of road signs and rest stops on the way to elsewhere, yet never entering the village itself. We went up an elevated bridge to watch large trucks and tourist buses go by at high speeds. From the ground perspectives, the villages were invisible, blocked by concrete barriers. Jatiwangi was not a destination on this map, as you can see here, which showed only Cikampek as the beginning and Cirebon as the end, with rest areas in between. Yet rest area number 8 served an intriguing function as a new tourist landmark for villagers and visitors to Jaf, who approached it from the wrong side, as it were. Local families and Jaf artists have visited the rest area to play, posting a variety of pictures online that show them relaxing and frolicking on the empty road. These photographs, which I saw on Facebook, were evidence of an infrastructural presence that had at one time generated conflict between villagers, local authorities, and external forces. Yet when the dust settled, the spirit of techno-political modernity seemed both distant and curious. The nation was more connected, but rural Jatiwangi remained for the most part outside this infrastructural imaginary. This next section is titled Preserving the Earth. There were already signs of a sophisticated media assemblage in Jatiwangi when I first visited in 2012, even though the village suffered the constraints of rural connectivity with uneven Wi-Fi and cellular reception. Jaf manages a website, a Tumblr page, a Facebook page, a radio station, and a TV station, and a YouTube channel, as well as various file-sharing sites to disseminate their music albums and books. For every upcoming festival, Jaf creates a well-designed poster which they circulate on social media. Friends of Jaf, national and international, are invited to post these papers as their social media page profile for the duration of the festival. Jaf artists document special moments on Facebook and maintain regular social media contact with foreign artists who have visited them. Individual Jaf artists have been invited to prestigious arts programs abroad, and Jaf is a fixture at Indonesia's own large biennales and art gatherings. Its music bands have also been featured on national television more than a few times. The primary effect of Jaf's various projects and media engagements has been the amplification of Jaf's presence and social capital in the district. Youth are once again drawn to their hometowns by the cool factor of culture. And those who move to the big city are interested in moving back to their village. Local government actors pay attention to Jaf, and civil servants attend their meetings and participate in art projects. Jaf's networks extend to places like Perth, Manila, Copenhagen, Warsaw, Seoul, Fukuoka, Bangalore, Miami, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam. Jatiwangi can seem like a globalizing village that has entered national and global art circuits, but it is also a place that is disadvantaged by rural poverty and high unemployment, leaving it vulnerable to the urbanizing forces of global capital and state-led infrastructural intervention. Primarily, this has meant a threat to the traditional roof tile industry, which is now disappearing in some places and replaced by manufacturing factories. So, writing about the powerful hold of technopolitical objects on human imagination and subjectivity, Brian Larkin paraphrases Walter Benjamin's formulations of things that operate as forces and signs of history. Quote, "They form us as subjects not just on a technopolitical level, but also through this mobilization of affect and the senses of desire, pride, and frustration, feelings which can be deeply political," end quote. Jatiwangi's most abundant natural resource is clay, or tanah, an elemental ingredient in most building projects. Its main commodity has an integral role in the story of Indonesian modernity. The iconic brick-colored wavy roof tile with its simple interlocking technology has been exported to the rest of the country and to other parts of Southeast Asia for over a century, and locals are very proud of the fact that their roof tiles once adorned all government buildings. The affective thing that mobilizes local sentiment is the rooftile, or genteng, is tied to an older understanding of infrastructure as local industry. Jeff researchers and artists have discovered that local youth no longer feel a connection to the land through rice cultivation, preferring other work opportunities instead. However, there has been a renewed interest by the same youth generation to inherit and carry on the rooftile businesses that their parents' generation left behind. One of the youngest factory owner managers is only 26 years old, a distinction that he's very proud of. Art and politics intersect here. The interests of factory workers to save an ailing industry coincide with Jeff artists' interests in fostering local participation and recuperating local livelihoods and cultural identity. And you can see one of the messages on the screen here that talk about brotherhood, and earth, and authenticity to be found in clay. The word tanah, meaning variously clay, earth, land, or soil, is laden with nationalist significance as well as local claims to terroir. It has therefore become a most effective concept for unifying local identity. Jeff artists draw upon the multiplicity of the word in their projects to diversify and multiply its meanings. Tanah is a theme in all of Jeff's projects, and since visiting artists are mandated to engage with local villagers and explore local issues, Jatiwangi's clay, land, and earth form the material bedrock of all their art projects as well. The richness of the concept tanah sustains art on territory, land use, environmentalism, heritage, urbanization, as well as other projects that explore the sensuous and scientific properties of the clay itself. For the project Clay Neoism, in 2015, Jeff artist Al Gori traveled to Eindhoven for the Age of Wonderland festival, bringing with him different clays from Jatiwangi for an on-site performance of clay-based cuisine. Images from the festival show a room decorated with a large canvas backdrop painted with a color chart of the different clays, while at the lab table, Al Gori demonstrated how to smell, taste, and bake clay cookies in front of his Dutch audience. They've also done something similar in the art museum in Jakarta. Jeff's most salient attempts at generating mass participation and national level publicity often involve the two local mainstays of genteng, which is the roof tile, and jabor, which is the tile factory. Large-scale works involving 1,000 villagers playing music on genteng, or entertaining events like bodybuilding competitions for factory workers employed at jabor, have received positive television and online coverage by national news outlets. These art spectacles enable their participants to deliver potent messages about the sustainability of the roof tile industry to village and district decision makers, even though the critical messages never survive the national news channels' need to portray Jeff events as evident of a quaint and harmonious rural life. At the same time that Jatiwangi's rural past and present are being displaced in most of their residents' imagination in favor of a heritage industry deemed equal, if not superior, to the invasive species of new garment factories, Jatiwangi remains a quintessential small place to most outsiders. Arjun Appadurai, the anthropologist best known for his theories of globalization, theorizes that contemporary senses and identities of place, which he calls locality, is fragile and must be constantly maintained, particularly in light of global media flows. I see the work that Jeff does as one of constant maintenance of place and community. One of the lessons Jeff artists have learned involves the modulation of scale. They use social media, formal and informal discussions, and art festivals to stage grand spectacles and to convey the intimate nuances of local issues and experiences. In both big and small works, that they are able to assert something of the community by metaphor, metonym, or spectacle. Their arts practice engages publicity without institutionalizing it and gives us a new way of thinking about art as activism. And I'm going to end here with an update from the latest activities that Jeff has been engaging in. Here is a Google Meetup in the COVID era, which says, let's meet virtually first. And it's the 15th anniversary of JAF, and they're still going strong in their projects in fostering a very strong sense of local cultural identity based on Tanah and Genteng. Thank you.
That was a very insightful video presentation from Professor Dr. Lee. Now let's wait for the second video presentation.
Hello, I'm Arya Adiprawijana of Universitas Pajajaran. I'm very delighted to be here, and I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to the organizers of ICONIC for their having invited me to speak in this conference. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to have been invited to be given this opportunity to share my varied thoughts and fragmented experiences in the intersection between art, activism, and academia. On this occasion, I would like to present my observations and views based on my own experiences crossing over what seems to be different spheres of action, namely art, activism, and academia. While often in my oscillations from one to the other and back, I encounter familiar faces, seeing activists and academics as spectators in art and cultural events, artists invited to display works and perform in academic forums as a kind of comic relief at times, as well as showing support for the others' efforts as a kind of favor, a collegial favor. In very few instances do I actually see an actual collaboration. One is often inserted as a supplement for the other's efforts rather than, let's say, each complementing each other. Perhaps my field of vision and experiences are actually limited, but that limitation is exactly my point. What keeps me from having a more in-depth and extensive participation in other fields? So as a person who makes his living, so to speak, in the academic world, I must also admit that I constantly have prejudices about activists and professional artists. And I assume also that activists and artists also have reservations and prejudices about academics, some of which I most probably agree with. But the fact that those prejudices and those presumptions exist among us shows how there is a barrier that keeps us from knowing each other better and hindering an actual balanced collaboration between the actors of those three spheres of action. So I would like to speak about art as intervention and at the same time share the issue of the need to cross over and back between the three spheres of action, which of course entails a rethinking of what artistic, activist, and academic endeavors are and what they can mean. I will specifically take the examples of projects in which I was directly involved. Because basically, honestly, my expertise is not in either art or activism, but rather in literary studies as an academic. And therefore, most of my examples will be very myopic. It will only mostly pertain to theater and literacy, as that is the field that I'm most familiar with. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. First, I would like to talk about the idea of art as intervention. as opposed to, let's say, art as a means by which norms are preserved. And second, I'd like to talk about art as or in activism, as well as art as activism. That is, art as not merely an intervention that disrupts and questions prevailing norms and order, but also prompt action to bring about social change. And finally, I would like to propose that the notion of the merging of art and activism into the classroom and research, and not merely research about art and activism, but research as activism and bringing that into the classroom as a part of the curriculum, taking advantage of the institutional nature of academia to foster the sustainability of both art in activism, as well as art as activism and as activism in itself, which often, as I will talk about later, involves a kind of artfulness. Art, I think, clearly is not by nature an intervention. We can see art in various ways, and historically speaking, art has served various functions. It has historically been used by the establishment and authority to preserve the status quo, to preserve the ones in power, the prevailing norms and order. For example, in his seminal Theater of the Oppressed, a very prominent theater practitioner, and as well as alternative literacy advocate and activist Augusto Boal offers a critique of the classical idea about art as proposed by Aristotle in his Poetics. Boal argues that Aristotle's conception of tragedy in particular, while implying also the general idea of the Aristotelian notion of the well-made play, and for the purposes of this presentation also high art in general, that Aristotle's ideas is coercive in nature, as it serves as an instrument for the ruling power to enforce control over the imagination of the public or the people who are subject to that ruling power. The Aristotelian ideals that Boal critiques are also apparent in the writings of such 18th century neoclassicists as Alexander Pope, for example. I apologize for using literature as an example, as well as 19th century literary figures as Matthew Arnold, who uphold those kinds of thinkers uphold the idea that art should represent, quote unquote, the best that has been thought and said in the civilized world. However, we also know of art, historically speaking, which critiques social conditions, art which satirizes. We are acquainted with art which, instead of representing established accepted norms, it represents views that opposes normativity or the prevailing norms and values of a particular society at a particular time. Yet there are similarities in the two opposing roles of art and the artist, both art which represents normativity as well as art that critiques normativity, in that they both assume the privilege and the place of the artist in society. For the present time, this is problematic in Indonesia as anywhere else. Alina Campana observes that, and I quote, artists embrace or struggle against the notion that they are isolated and alienated from society, which conceives artists as being solitary ascetics, dissociated from the realities of social life, unaffected by the political struggles and contestations that exist in society. Not only Campana, but also an art critic that Campana cites and refers to on this issue, Susie Gablick, notes that indeed, quote, and I quote, individualism and freedom were the great modernist buzzwords, but they are hardly the most creative response to our planet's immediate needs, he says, which, according to Gablick, demands complex and sensitive forms of interaction and linking. And Gablick further says that such relationships require a consciousness that is different from the structural isolation and self-referentiality of individualism. This is especially urgent in our current time, almost 2 decades after Gablick proposes her concept of connective aesthetics in 1997 or in 1992. In a world in which one action, one social phenomenon in one part of the world affects inevitably other social phenomena and other social conditions in other parts of the world, how do we maintain a sense of selfhood? Does the idea of the self change, and therefore does the idea of the self of the artist change, or the activist change, or the academic change in a world that's very much intricately connected? Perhaps we might be able to look back to the idea proposed by Hannah Arendt when, in her seminal *The Human Condition*, she talks about the shift from work to action, from mere production of artifice to producing social relations, which forms the basis of human interaction and ultimately society. And in this spirit, I think, Boal provides the model for art as action, as he also proposes to dismantle the separation between actor and spectator in theater, and for the purposes of my talk today, the separation between artist and the public. I myself began to think of this urgency in my explorations of how gendered, raced, and classed bodies figure in postcolonial discourse as my field of interest in literary studies and cultural studies in my daily activities carrying out literary scholarship. And while doing this, I asked the question of whether it is sufficient to talk about bodies, and whether there are other means of exploring how gendered, raced, and classed bodies find their way and place in social life. And I think this is the concerns which becomes the focus of Campana's article, and that is where she proposes a new definition of the artist's role. Similarly, she also offers a broader conception of the activist as not limited to individuals protesting in the streets, for example. Campana also warns that the conventional idea of activists and academics as educators often shows in practice where the activist and academic become agents of, and I quote, indoctrination of the masses being led by the few, and the few referring to, of course, activists and academics as elite members of society. And that becomes a risk for democracy when only the activist and the academic come together. The kind of activism initiated by individuals or groups who simultaneously play the roles of artist, activist, as well as academic or educator, have the potential of fostering democratic, social, and political life by opening alternative avenues where, and I quote Campana again, insurgent citizens who challenge those with political and cultural power, as well as honor the critical tradition within the dominant culture that makes such critique possible and intelligible. And I think that is what our society needs today, a society that in which individualism and digital technology has so affected human interaction that participation is almost or like participation in daily life almost is almost non-existent. Right. So art in activism as well as art as activism. And in my experience, as soon as I began undergraduate studies in the late 80s, I was introduced to activism on campus. While at the same time, ironically enough, even on campus, activism and academic activity were spoken of as separate and even incompatible spheres of action, occupying the same space. However, even then, in the late 1980s, art and activism had already presented themselves as mutually supportive, as also often the people were identified as artists are also those who are known as activists, or at least activists and artists mingled in the same social circles in which academics are not most of the time welcome. One artistic activist phenomenon very characteristic of Bandung was, and it still is, jeprut. It's a Sundanese word that means literally snapped, like a broken piece of string, which may be likened to or may be categorized as a kind of happening art or performance art, in which the artist activist performs in public spaces as a form of resistance to authority, and at that time, particularly the Suharto regime and its coercive apparatuses, particularly military. This may be the same trend as the theatrical performances in the streets in Manila, for example, by PETA, as a form of protest in resistance to the authoritarian Marcos regime in the 80s. On this note, James Jasper even notes that artfulness, although he's actually talking about the kind of art as activism or art in activism in the US and Europe, I suppose, artfulness appears in all the dimensions of protest, singly or simultaneously. And furthermore, Dr. Doreen Lee, the other speaker in this section of the conference, also observes that this quote-unquote tradition had also continued the artist activist culture following the Reformasi, as she thoroughly studied the street art of the youth of Jakarta, as well as the particular example of the artists who carry out artistic activities and organize performances at the Jatiwangi Art Factory in the district of Majalengka, West Java, which for me is really an offshoot of the artist activist culture in Bandung. While the artist activist community of Bandung created this pastoral sanctuary in Jatiwangi, it also had to address, even after the presumed socio-political reforms of the Reformasi, in the specific cases like that of Babakan Siliwangi, which is the urban green space, as well as a meeting place for artist activists. And they had to address and resist and respond to the increasing efforts of commodifying the landscape of Bandung to serve the commercial goals of Bandung tourism. So in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, 2003, and 4, there were efforts of transforming this urban green space into a kind of tourist attraction, which many artists activists disapproved of. Another site of contestation between artists and activists and the coalition of state and corporations is the area around the Bandung City Square, or the Alun-Alun Bandung, commonly known as ex-Palaguna, where there had been a shopping center called Palaguna, having been demolished. Artists and activists and the community in general thought that the demolition was to make space for a cultural and literacy center in the service of public interest. Although it turns out that there are also plans of setting up a hotel and a mall there, which invited a lot of resistance and disapproval from the society in general, as well as the artist activist community. While the friction seems to have died out in the case of Babakan Siliwangi, the ex-Palaguna remains a site in which 3 generations of artist activists continue to perform there as a reminder of the unresolved struggle, and also as a site of where this artist activist presence in Bandung make itself known to the public, as well as known to the authorities of the local government. I had been involved actually in both sites at different times. 2 of the most memorable for me would be when the installation of Tisna Sanjaya, at present an artist as well as a professor at an art professor at the Bandung Technological Institute. And the installation by Tisna Sanjaya, which symbolized a critique of the military, which had been displayed abroad, was burned down by the authorities in 2004, saying that it looked like trash, which prompted, of course, a protest in the form of a series of performances at the site of the act of state violence. And the other is in a collaborative performance in relation to the ex-Palaguna issue. And at the time, I was involved. I participated as a performer, going through the streets around the city square, and our performance ended because the police at the time was told us to disperse, saying that the performance has the risk of inciting public unrest, although that area is full of street performances. So if there's time in the question and answer, I can go into detail into the details of the event. My point is that the Artist Activist Alliance had existed in Bandung, I think, since the 1970s, as Dr. Doreen Lee also mentions in her work, tracing back to the exponents around the magazine Aktuil, and that this activist artist community has, in fact, I think, become an integral part of the culture of Bandung. Now, my just being in that particular community, although I was not particularly identified as either an artist or an activist, had also taken me to my involvement in the making of a documentary meant to be used as an educational material for labor education. The documentary, entitled Globalization Tapes, was carried out under the direct charge of the Indonesian office of the International Union of Food Workers, or IUF, based in Geneva, and the Indonesian office was based in Bandung. It was then that my academic endeavor in post-colonial studies, in post-colonial theory, found its way, or initial way, into activism. The project was designed so that ultimately the daily workers of the plantations in North Sumatra documented themselves and commented on the social situation and on their place in the global economy, which exploited them, making them have to research the history of global exploitation of workers from colonial times. The project directed by Joshua Oppenheimer and Kristen Seen intervened in the normalcy of the plantation workers as in their daily lives, and in turn the workers as filmmakers carried out the intervention in public spaces in other parts of North Sumatra, particularly in Medan, the capital of the province. The project also brought Oppenheimer's attention to the particular instances which became the germ of the ideas that he had for his acclaimed works, namely the act of silence and the act of killing and the look of silence. What was for me personally important was that the project showed the possibility of crossovers and the blurring of roles and social identities, not only between artists, activists, and educators, but also making the plantation workers themselves become all three roles performing all three roles at the same time. Plantation workers became not only plantation workers, but also artists, activists, as well as educators for other workers in the sector. My most recent involvement in the merging of art, activism, and academic endeavor was my participation in a number of projects organized by the Bandung Performing Arts Forum, or BPAF for short, which is a group of young artist activists whose aesthetic projects constantly require rigorous research and serious theatrizations and involve direct community participation, which both merge the artistic, activist, and academic efforts, and therefore it dismantles the separation between not only the artists and the public, as well as the community members becoming artists, and artists recognize themselves as being involved members of society. And it is in this condition that redefines or that rethinks what acts constitute art, what kind of activities can be categorized as art, what activities are activism, and what activities are academic endeavors. My experiences in being involved in projects which bring theater and performance to address and become part of social issues has also changed my way of viewing my role in higher education and my understanding of what higher education means, and what it means to teach, and redefining what it means to carry out academic endeavors. My colleagues and I, particularly in the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies at Universitas Pajajaran, have not only brought learning and research to the community as stipulated by the authoritative policy on higher learning, the three Dharma, or the three dharmas of higher education, but also we have had the pleasure of bringing the community, artists and activists, into the classroom. I myself have on several occasions collaborated with for example, literary activists as well as members of the BPAF in developing the syllabus of and teaching in the course that I teach. What I've learned from art and activism have enabled me to deal with the varied learning aptitudes of my students. It has also made it possible for students to be acquainted with the kind of connective aesthetics as Susie Gablick proposes, and activism as an integral part of their academic activities. At present, taking advantage of the pandemic actually, we now at Universitas Pajajaran have the pleasure of having artists and activists take our courses online together with our registered students. By bringing the long tradition of the Art Activism Alliance in Bandung, we hope that the academic life at our university at least can be fueled with the kind of spirit for social change and that we find in the connective aesthetics and activism. And in turn, perhaps academia may return the favor by taking advantage of its institutional nature to help ensure the sustainability of the efforts of art and activism. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation from Dr. Jagaiswara. So now we can open the Q&A sessions if there are participants who would like to ask questions to Professor Lee, or for Dr. Jagaiswara, you can type your questions in the chat room. I haven't found any questions in our chat room here. Pari, can I just call you Pari?
Yes, usually you do. So
It's easy. Yeah, it sounds more natural that way. Well, while waiting for questions from our participants, I was just like wondering during your presentations. I remember that there are people who assume that art cannot give any impact for social change. So what's your opinion on that? Like, why do you think there are people who assume that way?
well, thank you for the question, Herlin. If I may call you Herlin, that's why I usually call you. I think one of the reason is, I think I mentioned also in my presentation that the assumption comes from a very long standing, an age-long understanding that art is separate from social life, that art is sort of like a sanctuary. You know, the way an ascetic goes to a mountain or to the woods, you know, in the sense of Henry David Thoreau going to Walden. And this kind of romantic idea of the art, the role of the artist persists in our daily life, and often people actually choose to become artists because they want to separate themselves from the world. But of course, in this age where we're all connected, and not only the artist must be a part of their local environment, the artist has no choice but to become a part of a global world and be concerned with the issues that exist in the world, as local and global issues are integrally connected and are inseparable. So yeah, that idea that the artist is separate is a long-standing thing, and I think even artists, activists, the ones that I know of, have difficulties in let's say spreading this new redefinition of art and artist among artists themselves, as artists tend to, especially in my field, in literary circles, there's a tendency of writers to, let's say, keep keep to themselves, in a solitary situation. As writing, of course, their art becomes a part of, becomes a solitary activity. But more and more now, artists and even writers become part of uh, social issues, become address social issues, and um, and they must. I think the challenge is for artists when and even activists when they want to become part of addressing the social issues, they must sort of like let go of their ego. Their ego as the glorified artist, the one who gives enlightenment to the masses, and so on. So I that may be for many artists a difficult thing to let go of, their special role in society.
I see. So how about letting go of the aesthetic values of the art itself? Like some people are also like say worried, like when we use arts as a means to generate social movement, then it is aesthetic value and the form of the art itself are still important or not. Like what do you think about this kind of tensions, especially probably among the artists, as you said? Maybe you can also share from your experience when designing this kind of project.
Well, I think the main goal, I think the short-term goal, is to change the definition and the standards of aesthetic values. If you read classical, referring to classical treatises about art, Aristotle's Poetics, Horace's Ars Poetica, and so on, there seems to be an understanding that art has some kind of essential, predetermined value. And I think that needs to change, trusting that anyone can be an artist, and we shouldn't, and artists should learn not to force or to impose certain kinds of aesthetics to everyone. And I think, for example, in my experiences, both in the classroom as well as, let's say, in Medan, in the plantations in North Sumatra, the artist needs to learn to trust, and to learn new things, and not believe that the aesthetic values that they have hold on to thus far is in fact absolute. It turns out that plantation workers have contribute a lot to our definitions and criteria about what art is and what aesthetic value is. And in a way, as I said before, artist often serves as like a gatekeeper to traditionalism, to conservatism, about aesthetic values. But my point in my talk is that so long as art could be understood not as sort of like a way to preserve traditional values or values that we have held as being absolute, but art as an intervention. An intervention meaning if art can serve as a rupture in the continuity of discourses, in the continuity of aesthetics, the continuity of sensibilities. And that also means that artists slash activists slash perhaps also academics must intervene also in that idea of the absolute, art, or in Bahasa or high art. Like in Bahasa Indonesia, we have this term, seni adiluhung, and I think the kind of art that we need to also still develop that is useful for the public is to intervene become a rupture, become a disruption to that idea of art as being absolute, as being inspired by some, Holy Spirit that comes into the artist. And yeah, so art becomes sort of like a part of social life. I think, if I may, Anthony Artaud, a theater practitioner in the early 20th century, mentions how in Balinese culture there is no word for art, and art becomes sort of like a part of everyday life, a part of just breathing and walking and talking, and because art, if art functions as intervention, it's also a site in which society is able to sort of like evaluate and contemplate on existing conventions and move on to other possibilities and alternatives.
Right. Thank you very much for your answer. Here I got one question. It's about the collaboration between artists, activists, and academics. So do you think in Indonesian context, can artists, activists, and academics collaborate for social movement? Because it seems that in our country, they tend to be on like separate side or on different side.
I can with some conviction that it's possible, because I've participated in it. I've learned to, go out of my ivory tower of campus and academia and learn to be involved in activism. I've learned to be an artist, both in theater, literature, and most recently in visual arts. And I think I don't know whether this sounds cheesy or corny, and I think the key is frankness and just pure sincerity. And I think if the relationship between the artist, the academic, and the activist is based on sort of like the sincere desire to learn and desire to contribute to social life, it's actually, from my experience, quite easy. With my interactions with BPAF, one of the projects that I participated in was a performance project that involves the community in the Ranca Chili housing project. So people who had been displaced from urban settings in the inner city were moved to this housing project, and the Bandung Performing Arts Forum, speared at the time by Taufik Darwis and Riyadu Salihin, invited performers and invited theater practitioners to participate in the project, and fortunately, they also invited me, not as an academic, but as someone who is willing to learn performance art and theater. And at the time, we went to the housing project, and we interacted with the communities there, and we talked, and together with the inhabitants of the housing project, we created performances in response to their condition. And at the time, one of the things that I learned, at least, was that each party is able to learn something from the other, because each party has something to contribute. And by each party, actually, there are four parties. There are artists, activists, academics, as well as the community members themselves. And each has something to contribute in terms of artfulness, and something to contribute in terms of redefining what art means, in the sense art as intervention, in addressing the present situation of at the time, the situation of displacement and creating a comment which, at least for the participants themselves, um, enabling the participants themselves to think of other ways of being and other ways of being a part of the community. So when that does happen, everyone learns. Everyone learns something new, and everyone's horizons develop and broadens. Not only the community members, so it's not like a charity case in which academics or activists or artists who are often from the middle class come to an impoverished community and say, "Oh, we have something for you because you don't have it," but rather, like we place ourselves in each other's shoes and make just eliminating the differences between academics, artists, activists, and community members, and we all become all roles. Academics become activists, artists, and community members. Community members becomes artists, academics, and roles. And of course, then we have to sort of like let go of our own professional identity. Letting other people become what we are. And I think mostly from academics, because I've experienced it myself. I think academics have a difficulty in acknowledging other people, artists, activists, and community members, as for in doing academic endeavors, as if we're the only ones who are able to do it. From my experience, that's not true. Academics are not the only ones who can carry out academic endeavor. Once at one point, actually, I sort of like did not believe that artists, activists, and let alone community members can do what I do. And I was fortunately reminded by Professor Melanie Budianta that that's not true. And I would be limiting myself if I would have that kind of viewpoint. And last night, she just delivered a very inspiring cultural speech at the Jakarta Arts Council. I think you can look at it at YouTube, and still she says the same things, and still still inspires me, and I'm sure it inspires Herlin also.
Yeah,
and
it's a very strong remark.
Yeah, and we're always reminded by her, right? And that this distinction between artists, activists, academic, and community members is something that is just going to handicap us. And I think she would be my model for playing all four roles: artists, academics, activists, and a concerned community member. And I hope that we can pay forward the favor that she has given us. Yeah.
Hopefully, let's be optimistic about it. There's, I got two questions here. The first one is from Lani. She is a teacher, and she is wondering how to bring critical awareness into her classroom, and how to make her students more attuned to social movement by using art and culture. Do you probably have any suggestions for her?
Okay, Bulani. It's a very difficult question to answer because I've had difficulties in doing so. Most of the time it's not successful, mostly because we only have like 1.5 hours with our students, and then the rest, the other 22.5 hours of the day, the student spends with the community, and this distinction, this encouragement not to be involved is again reinforced in daily life. So if you sincerely want to bring about social awareness into the classroom, it will take a lot of your own personal time, because then you'll have to communicate and interact with your students outside of the classroom. So I think, to put it in a simple way, in order for you to be able, not just Bu Lena, um,
Yeah, yeah.
not only for Bu Lena, but also like for me, also in order for us to be able to bring social awareness into the classroom, to bring social activism into the classroom, to bring art into the classroom, I think it's also important to bring the classroom to those other spheres of action, introducing students to uh, things that go on in daily life. And of course, then I know that I'm more privileged because I have more authority over the materials that I have in my classroom. And secondary schools teachers are more limited in what they're allowed to do, and the curriculum is more centralized. But then again, I think from my own experience, I think I have a lot of inspiration and thoughts from my SMP teachers and SMA teachers, mostly, and not all of them, just probably just one or two. But whenever you have that one teacher that that brings the world to us, and or brings us to the world, it sticks. It sticks in our minds. So I think, um, to make it even simpler, is that if you want to do it, just do it, and it usually works. If it's out of honesty and sincerity, things happen on its own. But if you need help, if you need support, I'm willing. My colleagues and I, particularly uh, at Universitas Pelajaran, at the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies, or even other colleagues, including Herlin, I think we would be very happy to be involved in whatever you're trying to do, to bring social awareness, to bring awareness of social issues in. And
Sure.
I think my email is available in.
Yeah.
I'll just write it
Yeah.
down. Write down my email. So
Right.
if you need to contact
Thank
me,
you.
have
Thank you.
ideas, you can email me. Thank you.
I'm sure there are many participants who would like to have some follow-up discussions with you. We still
Yes.
have one more question. This is the very last question, and time is very limited. So probably some brief answer or response from you. So
Yes.
this question is about Keputusan Menteri Pendidikan dan Kebudayaan nomor 754 tahun 2020. It's about arts, visual, audio, and performance, along with literary works, are recognized as academic outputs. How do you see this move by the government will affect activism within academia?
I think it will be very useful, so long as people actually want to implement it. Often in Indonesia you have these keputusan, and I'm sure this has something to do with who our director general of culture is at the current time. Dr. Farid has is, I think, influenced such decrees and regulations. But I think it takes more than an ESCA to bring about actual behavioral change. So I think there needs to be a movement together with artists, activists, academics, and community members to actually implement this ministerial decree. So in itself, the ministerial decree is not going to be carried out. We actually have to, let's say, encourage our own colleagues, encourage our students, encourage our partners in the different spheres of action, activists encouraging academics, academics encouraging activists, activists encouraging artists, so that we can, produce this audio visual performances as academic outputs, and recognizing the contribution of each party. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm sure that wraps up our panel discussion with Dr. Ari and Professor Lee as well. So if I can just briefly sum up some key points that we have gained through our discussion today is that we have discussed the potential of arts to invigorate civil discourse and how civil engagement and social movement often take place when they are enhanced through the creative expressions of the arts. Some case studies shared by our speaker have demonstrated how local communities are working creatively and collectively with artists, activists, as well as academics in responding to the pace of change as a significant effort to protect their local identity. So I think that's all that I can summarize as the key points from our discussion. Thank you for our distinguished speakers for the very insightful and intriguing presentations. I will now hand it back to our MC. Thank you.
Terima kasih Mbak Herlin dan juga Dr. Ari untuk diskusinya yang menarik mengenai art and activism. Again, for those who'd like to participate in the discussion, you could enter by using the link appear on the screen. And we will continue Iconic 2020 activities with the roundtable discussion.